Let's now listen to Maximo Torero on disruptive information across the value chain. Maximo has been introduced already as the Executive Director at the World Bank Group for Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru and Uruguay. He was a Division Director and a global player at the International Food Policy Research Institute. You find a bio in the material. Maximo.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Joachim. So what I'm going to talk a little bit is about some disruptions. Since this conference were started to be planned, I have been dreaming with disruptions. So I hope I can reflect my dreams in this presentation and where I'm looking at. So first, as everybody knows here, the world that we are facing today is a world that has a huge demand for calories and for food. We have to increase production around 60% to be able to arrive to the potential world demand. At the same time, we are facing risks, but I normally focus more when we talk about climate change, not only in extreme temperatures, but also on volatility and the variance, the second moment of weather and how that will affect farmers. The ecosystem decline, 25% of the production, of the productivity is only going to happen unless we increase land, and that means eliminating forests, or water also is becoming a very scarce resource in the world, and land is deteriorating quality. And finally, we have surprises, no? Like the eruption that just happened in Hawaii and also happened in Guatemala, and so on and so forth. So there are many surprises that are happening in this world, and that means that we need to be ready, and we not only need to be ready, but we need to have a great balancing act. We need to close the food gap. We need to support economic development. 28% of global population directly and indirectly is engaged with agriculture. And at the same time, we need to reduce the environmental impact, the 24%. So what to do? And that's where innovations and disruptions could help. Revolutions in technology could help to achieve this. But it's complex because of this balancing act. So let me start with my first disruption. I have 4 disruptions today. And let me explain a little bit about it. So my first disruption is what has happened in terms of automatization. And basically, this is just a graphical reflection by Professor Cork of the evolution of tractors. No? It came from being used by horses to machinery, and now to very sophisticated equipment, big equipment, and very sophisticated equipment. But the problem with this is that this is mostly for large farms because of economies of scale. So it requires significant, but it has been a huge disruption, what we have seen in the savannah with all the efforts of Embrapa, what we have seen in the coast of Peru, for example, and in many other regions of the world, technology and automatization has helped amazingly to increase productivity and velocity of harvest to be able to get the results we want to achieve. Now, one of the problems with this technology is the size and the weight of the equipment. And the reason is because they want to sit well-fed people like me in those tractors. And they need the space to do that. And they need the space to put the GPS locators and all the automatization. And that creates a problem. Why? Because it creates pressure over the land and therefore affects the quality of the soils and generates potential externalities into it. And the evolution of the tractor size have created those potential problems that we need to look at it carefully. But at the same time, using these large technologies for large-scale production, we have been able to evolve and develop new things. The top graph is showing how initially we were doing the weeding with a lot of labor intensity. But now there are new technologies that have been developed. Blue River technology has just been purchased, for example, by John Deere, the tractor company. And they are able now to really focus and eliminate automatically this monster, which basically is the weeds, which basically affects the productivity because affects the nutrients that come to the plant. And normally the technology didn't allow you to target properly. What this new technology of Blue River does is basically allows you to specifically target the weeds and use the herbicides specifically for those weeds. What it means that I won't contaminate the plant, and it means I won't kill the plant too. And it's very important because it helps specifically to eliminate and to work with organic farming, which we are very intensive today, and we want to move towards organic farming in many cases. But now I won't contaminate them because I will be able to target with this specific technology developed by Blue River, and which John Deere has captured. They paid $305 million for this enterprise. Luckily, it's of an uncle of mine, so it's great. So the issue now is how is really John Deere going to evolve on this, or is John Deere going to capture this, not use it, and therefore eliminate the potential growth of this type of technologies. The hypothesis, I was in your dear town last week, and is that they are going to use it and they are going to expand it. And not only that, they are going to do something else onto it, which is linked to this issue, which is what really concerns places like the bank and all the multilateral organizations. And it's extremely important because we need to show that multilateralism works. And is that agriculture is primary source of livelihood in emerging countries, but particularly in the smallholders. So what we see here is that the distribution of agricultural holdings are basically smallholder based, around 84%. And of the agricultural labor force, 40% is female. But across the different regions of the world, with exceptions, and Latin America is one of the biggest exceptions, Brazil, the case of the coast of Peru, not the Andes, but in Senegal, in Ethiopia, in India, especially in Asia, we see, and in China, although China is changing very fast, we see that smallholders are really there, and we need to find ways to be flexible. So those large technologies, those large tractors, no matter we have now this great technology to be able to target the weeds, needs to improve. And that brings me to my disruption number 2. And this is basically, and I will show you a little video, this is the plant of of Amazon. Basically, they are using very small, flexible robots to be able to develop what normally people were going to develop. So they are creating a technological change and innovation where technology is now flexible to scale. And I am very smart in combining the use of these robots with the use of the size of the spaces and how I can optimize my allocation and my delivery of the products I need to sell and the way I have to move around commodities to be as efficient as possible and trying to optimize how I allocate. So this is the value chain concept I think that David and that was talking before. Now, is this happening in agriculture for smallholders? Yes, it's starting to happen and very fast. So these are very small tractors that can play a significant role in agriculture today and that can allow you to do many of the things that I mentioned before. And at the end, what we are going to observe is something like this in the small plots. So small robots which are going to do the job in very small scale, so scale neutral. Not necessarily I will need anymore a large plot. And the economic case of these robots is pretty good. It's $10,000 each of them. And they can move basically at a quarter the velocity that the bigger tractor, and they can cover a significant area of space. The issue is how we afford the cost and how we eliminate the budget constraint, and that's where new ideas, like for example the idea of the Uber tractor, or innovative ideas which will allow us to share this type of technologies, will allow us to basically use this type of robots. These are another option, another way of, these robots, for example, not only look at the weeding, but also they do soil samples, which is crucial to look what inputs I need to apply to the field, which normally we don't do. We normally deploy very smart subsidies, very fancy mechanisms, and we never know what are the micronutrients we are giving to the soils and not what they really need. And this type of technology will allow to do that. So how we can reduce the budget constraint, I think is central and is something that we need to look at it carefully. Now, but this type of technologies and this type of disruptive technologies require, and we need to be careful in many elements, because of inclusion, because of efficiency, and because of innovation, because I want to scale up and expand the access of this technology around. So what are the 3 key elements that I think are important? First is the access, which is linked to costs, adaptability to the location, in this case scale neutral, trying to move to small plots, small farmers, which is our priority. And third is appropriate. And appropriate means for me capability. So how I can transfer this type of technologies to an aging population in rural areas, a population which doesn't have education and so on and so forth. So how we can comply with that. And let me bring an example that I like working a lot, which is ICTs. So as you know, the growth of cellular phones and ICTs has been huge. Now, the red line, which is basically the number of cellular phones in the world, is higher than the population. This graph goes until 2013, but if we do it up to today, it has grown furthermore. Not only that, it has expanded around the world. People initially didn't thought that it would go to rural areas. It has expanded all over the world, and the world is now based on an internet population. And there are many things that are happening in terms of access to internet around the world. We have web traffic, tweets, and so on and so forth. But as it was reported in the WDR 2016, the problem is what is happening between and within countries and in access to capability. And here is where we see differences. We see difference in income access. We see difference between young and old. We see difference between rural and urban. And we see difference between women and men. That's one of the concerns of these disruptive technologies, because they can increase inequality in all of these fronts. So how we can do to avoid that, and how we can comply with those 3 A's that I mentioned before to try to minimize that risk. And this is just a subsample of some countries looking at the gap of cellular phones in rural. Normally, we get reports from ITU, which is aggregate numbers for the country. But when you go into surveys and look exactly at what is the difference between the rural, you will see that in many countries like Tanzania, for example, the gap between urban and rural is huge. The average number for the country is big, but within rural and urban is important and something to look at. So we have a significant digital divide in the case of a technology which has already diffused massively, and there is a lot of things that we can do to be able to reduce this divide. So this could be because of productivity bias, because of a skills bias, or because of voice bias. But we need to find solutions to that and trying to find ways in which we can optimize from that disruption that we want to create with these technologies. So here is where the concept of complements that I refer in the morning plays a role. And that's where we need to be prepared to be able to make these technologies feasible. So with complements, meaning that we have the institutionality, the regulation, the governance behind, the digital technologies could create innovation, could create efficiency, could create inclusion. But if we don't have the complements in place, it could create concentration, it could create inequality, and it could create problems of control and not inclusion. And that's what we need to avoid. That's why we need to move in parallel, and places like the World Bank has to be ready to be able to do that in place. And why? Because we need to have the regulatory systems in place, the skills, and the institutions in place to be able to comply with all this process of the technology evolution, which could be emerging, transition, and transforming. The advantage of technology is that it can leapfrog very fast. So if we are not ready from the beginning, then we could have a lot of problems. And that's what we need to avoid. And that's where I think multilateral institutions and research institutions have to play a significant role. This is basically to show the race between technology and complements, between high income, which are the green, upper middle income, which are the blue, and lower middle income, which are the red, and low income. The typical relationships that we'll have expect with these complements. If we are going to invest in either the most poor countries in the bank or in middle income or low middle income or poor countries, we need to move fast and we need to leapfrog those in the bottom to the top to be able to profit from these technologies because the technologies are ready, as I mentioned before, to be able to do that. So the second element is the content, which I call adaptability. In the case of phones or in the case of internet, is what we want. We want good content for the farmers. We don't want to provide them content which is not necessarily what they want and what they need. And that's typically the case. So there are several things that people refer to of the beauty of ICTs, extension, market information, policy environment, natural resource, and health. But when we did a review together with Nakasonia and Barminten, we found in this summary of a graph, basically we split it by low value crops, mixed crops, and medium and high value crops. And the horizontal axis shows the level of penetration. The major impact happened when the penetration of cellular phones was very low. This is the famous fish case of Kalali fishes that was done, and also many of the papers at the beginning when the penetration of cellular phones was very low because the asymmetry of information was huge, and therefore they could make a difference. But when we move into high penetration like we have today, only when we provide high quality of information, we have a difference. And that's the extreme right in the graph, those 2 or 3 papers that show certain impact when we do a proper impact evaluation. High value commodity, high penetration, but good quality information. So the quality of the information is central and matters and allows you to be able to use it. If not, the technology won't matter. That's why we need to have technology that has the proper content. And then capability, which is one of the biggest constraints because illiteracy is huge around the world, and especially in the countries matters for us to be able to move people out of poverty. So how we transfer these technologies, how we transfer these fancy robots that do all these different things to these poor people that most of them don't know how to read and write, and they will find ways to access to the technology. Many of them will have cellular phones. And the way to do that, for me, is to move in what I call my disruption number 3. And the disruption number 3 is milagros, miracles in English. Milagros is a kid from a secondary school, at the age that some of the previous speakers mentioned. She works in Yacanora, in Cajamarca, in Peru. And the idea of Milagros was for her to be the bridge. Normally, when we talk about stopping smoking or environmental issues in a school, we teach kids to do it so that they can teach parents, what we call upward intergenerational mobility. The advantage of Milagros is that she knows how to read and write, she knows pretty well mathematics, and she knows how to access to internet. It took her 24 hours to learn how to use the web, compared to teaching the same to a person of 50 or 70 years old. I cannot do many things today in internet. So, why Milagros is important? Because we have some evidence that the effect of parents to children could influence. The influence to children to adults has been studied by several social disciplines, but not economics too much. And recent studies that have studied the reverse direction of the transmission of information are present, but we have never tested really the upward intergenerational mobility. If I chuck information to the kid, how much it gets to the parent, how much the parent will adopt that change. And that's basically the role of Milagros. Milagros for me is the bridge, the translator, that will give the information to the parent in such a way that the parent can apply it. Typically, when I have a smartphone and they don't know how to read and write, they will use Milagros to do what they need to do because they know what they want. Farmers are very rational. So there are three works that we need to test this hypothesis. One is kids to kids. First, trying to see if we can provide through ICTs information to the kids that will change their behavior. And we did this with nutritional issues, and that worked pretty well. The paper is already published in the American Economic Journal. From kids to parents, we did it in two ways, with technology and without technology. And what we found is that it changed the behavior of parents. So the upward intergenerational mobility helped. So the role of Milagros as a bridge did work. So this is to try to resolve these issues of extension by going even more sophisticated things that kids can do. So the idea was to test if IT extension provide to students translating to increase agricultural knowledge to parents and how much it translates into adoption. And basically the idea was to go extension through the kids and then influence parents. And in India they did this empirically in several cases, also in other regions. But this is a formal randomized control trial to try to test something which clearly has a very easy way of doing external validity because it's very simple to replicate. And the other advantage is that it's cost effective because I can go to schools and I have the concentration of the kids which normally work in their farms. That's the typical case. Most of these kids in secondary school in rural areas will work from the farm. So we did this design, and I am not going to go into detail, but we identify all the problems that the farmers were facing in the plots, and then we try to bring solutions through the schools, through videos, to the kids, through internet, so that they can then see if that tests the kids. And we comply with all the rules of randomization. These are the types of videos that were simple to use because we wanted to minimize the budget constraint issue to try to bring this is a solution, for example, for corn earworm. So some technology, so we basically did this ITT specification. We also did an ATE specification, and the result basically is that first knowledge is transmitted. We were able to transfer knowledge to kids. We are able to have a significant increase of 21 to 30%, so 6 to 9 percentage points in terms of knowledge. We also were able to identify in the late the similar impact. So using random assignment as an instrument for watching the video, we find a similar significant effect. And then we also look at the heterogeneous effects, and as the typical effects we expect, we found education, like smaller gains among less educated responsible household member, larger gains if responsible member is male, age, larger gains if responsible member is younger. Then we also look at adoption of agricultural practices. We have a set of questions to the parents to see if they will adopt the technology, and we found that we increased the adoption of the technology in 3.2 to 4.9 percentage points with a small sample that we have. If we had a bigger sample, which we are trying to do now, we'll have a bigger, of course, impact. And the same with the late. So what we find at the end is that implemented field experiment to teach agricultural practice to high school students work. The information is transmitted. And when a student is taught on agricultural practice, the knowledge of the farm manager increases by 6 to 9 percentage points, 20 to 30%, and the adoption of the practice increased between 3.5 to 5 percentage points, 60 to 23%. So the role of Milagros as a bridge apparently works, and it will help me to transfer faster these technologies and try to leapfrog. So finally, because I only have 2 minutes left, my disruption number 4. And my disruption number 4 is very linked to complements and to policy making. And normally policy making, for me, in most of the cases, is a market failure. Because we make decisions without serious evidence. And that could create problems, especially when we have this type of technologies. So normally we have a small problem, and we try to use technology to solve that problem. But given that we don't have the proper evidence, we increase the problem. And what we do is we bring more policy things, and we complicate more the problem. And at the end, we create a big mess. So let me finalize with that and tell you that there is a huge effort that we need to do to be able to comply with these complements to profit from these technologies. Thank you very much.
So sitting in Ethiopia with 12.8% cell phone penetration rate as per your data, I don't feel that optimistic about the role of digital technologies, in agriculture in Ethiopia. And, just came back from China 2 weeks ago, and there I felt very optimistic. at the role of digital technology. So I want to get a sense from you to, when you look at this whole array of digital technology, I mean, there are a couple that have been mainstream, there are a couple that are ready to scale, there are a couple which are still at a piloting stage, and there are a couple which are still in R&D or science fiction phase. And when we are advising client countries such as Ethiopia, where digital dividend is still far remote, what would be your advice in terms of the pragmatism of which technologies are ready for scale and which are still in R&D phase?
Goals. Social protection has to be part of the story. Question, in a sense, is how do we rethink what kind of social protection do we have to have into place in such a fashion that we minimize the negative implications of the disruptions you have been describing?
Mm-hmm. How would you think all those digital technologies are actually going to change the need for regulations and the need for policing in many ways, because the asymmetry of information is somehow disappearing? The second is, I think that it's been a bit talked about, I think, by Professor Reardon, but it's the fact that it's the services side of things, and how we have all those services that were non-tradable and now are tradable, including extension services, and maybe the importance of other regulations that are going to prevent those services from being supplied, for example, data flows issues.
One to the power of kids. That's very fascinating, but I wonder what are really the policy implications, and that may relate to the counterfactual or the control group. What if we would have a traditional extension system that functions properly?
Okay, very quickly, the Ethiopia question, 12 to 12.8% of penetration. That's a policy problem, and it's, I think, a policy failure. I don't know if you're aware, but Ethiopia liberalized cellular phones a few years ago, and the demand was massive, but then they only control it through a state-owned enterprise. Ethiopia is fiber optics covered completely, so technology can switch even from cellular to broadband, so it shouldn't be a problem. It's a problem of a decision, and it's a problem of enforcement of that decision. So I don't see any issue in terms of accessibility, just that there is a problem in terms of how the government wants to control the access to cellular phones. In the case of Alan, I think your question is crucial, and it's the same issue of trade. No? When you have trade openness, you have distributional effects. So how we do the sequencing? So for me, there are two elements. First is targeting. So where I can come up with these interventions, or where these new technologies, disruptive technology, can play a role that will assure that you will have income. And that's in areas where basically you have potential and you have inefficiency, and technologies could help to resolve those inefficiency. But the income that you will get by just reducing that inefficiency without a shift of the frontier could be enough to move you out of poverty. There are areas where that won't happen because you don't have the characteristics of the soil and so on and so forth. And in those areas, transfers will go. But the sequencing, because in both areas there is a lot of poor people, the sequencing on how I phase out the transfers, any type of transfer, to the technology and the shift in terms of reduction of efficiency is central. That's why I was arguing that the complements are central, and we cannot wait until the end. So for me, the sequencing is even, I will start first with thinking how to design these things before even making this to happen, because it will create a lot of distributional effects and all the three elements that I mentioned. So we need to be very careful, and that's why a place like the bank needs to be ready for that, to be able to resolve that and to avoid and minimize potential distributional effects in the best possible way. But targeting is central. When we look at countries in Africa and in Latin America, for example, and we see the targeting of policies, the mismatches are huge. We are doing irrigation when there is no need of irrigation. We are putting, for example, in West Africa, there is a huge program putting fertilizers, which is not the type of fertilizer that the land needs. So all those mismatches, we can resolve it. And then, of course, you have these potential disruptive technologies playing into place. Now, in terms of the digital technologies and the need to change of regulations, I think technology and the disruption of technologies create changes that happen immediately. And most of the cases, they will be faster than potential changes in regulations. So we need to figure out how to handle that and how to move in parallel. What you want at the end is to avoid too much market concentration of power. You want to avoid one company controlling everything, although it's good at the beginning to create innovation, as David was mentioning initially, but at the end of the line, when you have these specific investments and sunk costs, all the Sutton theory, you need to avoid that and to allow penetration and entry, new entry into the sector, and that's what you want to avoid. That was my example of the John Deere tractor, which I don't know if John Deere bought this technology to deploy it more, or John Deere bought this technology to put it to sleep, because it could create competition with them. So those are the things that we need to be alert, because we don't want to lose those options, but the market works pretty well on that. In some countries, no, and that again linked to the answer of the complement. In terms of the kids, the contrafactual here, the control group was brushing their teeth. Okay, that was the contrafactual, the control group. So it was an RCT design, and we're deploying it in other countries. The policy implication for the first stage, which was just information for kids for nutrition, was great, because if I want to give a nutritional campaign, for example, it's easy to do it in the school through videos, and the kids will enforce this with the parents. We know it works now. And even they can make their own decisions. In this case, was taking an iron pill, and so on and so forth. When it goes up to the parents, again, my perception, these are secondary kids, these are not primary kids school. My perception is that the kids have something else that the robot doesn't have the feeling of knowing their parents and understanding from the parent. So they can translate this thing and make the parent hear, and we learned that. But there are heterogeneous effects. Male, female, male is different, and that's part what we are finding. But I think there is a lot of work to be continued on that, but it could make a lot cheaper to do any potential extension intervention, for example, or even knowledge on how to use this technology so that they can help their parents when they are doing it. Of course, it's sensitive, child labor, you want to avoid that, but on the other hand, new technologies can minimize the health effects that the current work they do have, like, for example, herbicides and how they are contaminated by doing that, because they really work today. So how we can improve and get to a second best, I think will be ideal.